Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. My car broke down last night. It was raining hard, really pouring. I was on a desolate road, no lights, no other cars, just me and the storm. I managed to get off to the side, but it didn't help much. My phone barely had any signal, but I got through to a tow truck. They said it would be hours before they could get to me. I sat there for a while, the rain hammering down on the roof. It was cold, and I was starting to feel the chill. I kept glancing at the phone, hoping the tow truck would somehow show up early. Then, out of nowhere, headlights appeared behind me. A car pulled up, and a man got out, umbrella in hand. He knocked on my window. "Need some help?" he asked. He looked normal enough, middle-aged, dressed for the weather. I hesitated but then rolled down the window a bit. "I've got a tow truck coming," I said. "But it'll be hours." He nodded, looking around. "You can't stay out here in this weather. I can give you a ride to the nearest town. It's just a few miles up the road." I was desperate to get out of the rain, and he seemed genuine. I grabbed my bag and got out, locking the car behind me. He led me to his car, a beat-up old sedan, and opened the passenger door for me. I got in, and he got behind the wheel. As we started driving, I tried to make small talk to ease my nerves. "Thank you for stopping. Not many people would in this weather." He smiled but didn't say much. We drove in silence for a bit, the rain pounding on the roof. After a while, I noticed we weren't heading toward any town. The road was getting narrower and rougher. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "To a safer place," he said, not looking at me. My heart started to race. "But you said the town was just a few miles away." He didn't respond. I glanced around, looking for anything that might help me. The doors were locked, and the windows wouldn't budge. I kept my hand on my bag, where I had my phone, but there was still no signal. The road got even rougher, and the car slowed down. I saw a clearing up ahead, but no buildings, no lights. Just trees and darkness. He pulled over and turned off the engine. "Why are we stopping here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He turned to me, his eyes cold. "You'll be safer here," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. I knew I had to get out. I fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't open. He reached over, grabbing my arm. I twisted away, using my other hand to hit the horn, hoping someone would hear. "Stop it," he hissed, trying to pull me back. I kicked out, catching him off guard. He let go for a second, and I managed to unlock the door and tumble out into the rain. I hit the ground hard but got up quickly, running toward the trees. The rain was blinding, and the ground was slippery, but I kept running. I heard him shouting behind me, his footsteps getting closer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I stumbled and fell, getting mud all over me. But I scrambled up and kept going. I couldn't see where I was going, just running blind. I could hear him behind me, but the rain was so loud it was hard to tell how close he was. I saw a light up ahead, faint but real. I pushed myself toward it, my legs burning. It was a cabin, old and run down, but the door was open. I rushed inside and slammed the door shut, locking it. There were no lights inside, just a dim glow from outside. I found a corner and hid, trying to catch my breath. I could hear him outside, yelling, but I stayed quiet. I prayed he wouldn't find me. After what felt like hours, the shouting stopped. I waited, terrified he might come back. But the rain kept falling, and eventually, I couldn't hear anything but the storm. I stayed in that cabin until morning. When the rain finally let up, I cautiously stepped outside. The man was gone, and there was no sign of his car. I started walking, sticking to the main road. It took me hours, but I finally found a ranger station and told them everything. They never found him. I don't know what he wanted, and I don't want to think about what might have happened if I hadn't escaped. I always loved jogging at night, even in the rain. The park was quieter, and the cool air felt good on my face. Last night was no different. It had been raining all day, and by evening, the park was almost empty. I put on my running shoes, grabbed my jacket, and headed out. Central Park was a maze, but I knew my usual route well. The rain picked up as I started running, the path ahead shimmering with puddles. The city lights reflected off the wet ground, giving everything an eerie glow. I was halfway through my run when I decided to take a different path. I thought it would be nice to change things up a bit. After a few minutes, I realized I wasn't sure where I was. The trees seemed denser here, and the path narrower. The rain was coming down harder, and it was getting difficult to see. I slowed down, trying to get my bearings, but nothing looked familiar. Then, I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was another jogger, but when I glanced back, I saw 3 men walking toward me. They were dressed in dark clothes, and something about them felt off. I quickened my pace, hoping they would just pass by, but they matched my speed. My heart started to race. I took a sharp turn down another path, hoping to lose them, but the footsteps grew louder. Panic set in. I was running full speed now, the rain blurring my vision, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I glanced back again. They were closer, and I could see their faces now, grim and determined. I turned a corner and nearly slipped, catching myself just in time. Ahead of me, the path split into 2. I took the left one, praying it would lead me back to a familiar area. The trees seemed to close in around me, the branches clawing at my jacket. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps pounding, their voices low and menacing. I stumbled over a root, falling hard onto the wet ground. My hands scraped against the rough path, and pain shot through my knees. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the throbbing in my legs. I had to keep going. I could hear them laughing now, their voices getting closer. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. I saw a small clearing up ahead, with a bench and a street lamp that flickered weakly. I ran toward it, hoping there might be someone there, but it was empty. The light cast long shadows, making the place feel even more sinister. I could see a path leading out of the clearing, and I sprinted toward it. The rain was relentless, and I was soaked to the bone. My jacket felt like it weighed a ton, and my shoes squelched with every step. The path twisted and turned, and I had no idea where I was going. I could hear them getting closer, their voices louder, taunting. I rounded a corner and saw a small building ahead. It looked like a maintenance shed, with a padlock hanging loosely on the door. I didn't think, just acted. I threw myself at the door, yanking it open and slipping inside. The door creaked loudly, and I pushed it shut behind me. Inside, it was dark and musty. I could barely see anything, but I found a stack of old boxes and crouched behind them, trying to calm my breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. The footsteps stopped outside the shed. I heard them talking, their voices muffled by the rain. One of them banged on the door, and I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. They tried the handle, but it held firm. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, they moved on. I could hear their footsteps fading, their voices growing distant. I waited, counting the seconds, my whole body trembling. When I was sure they were gone, I slowly stood up, my legs shaking. I peered out through a crack in the door. The path was empty, the rain still pouring down. I had to get out of there, find my way back to the main path. I slipped out of the shed, glancing around nervously. I started running again, every shadow and sound making my heart leap. The path seemed endless, but finally, I saw the familiar lights of the main road. I nearly cried with relief. I ran toward it, not stopping until I reached the edge of the park. When I finally got home, I was soaked, exhausted, and shaking. I locked the door behind me, my mind racing with what had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about those men, their faces, and how close they had come. I still love jogging at night, but now, I stick to the familiar paths. I had been hiking all day, and the rain started coming down hard as evening approached. I was in the middle of the woods, far from any town or road. The trail was muddy, and I was soaked. I needed to find shelter quickly. That's when I saw the cabin through the trees. It looked old and abandoned, but it was better than being out in the storm. I pushed through the wet underbrush and reached the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and smelled musty. I shook off the rain and stepped in, hoping to find a dry spot to rest. I found an old chair and a table, some broken shelves, and a small fireplace. There were no lights, but I had a flashlight in my pack. I set my things down and explored a bit. The cabin was just one room, with a couple of small windows. The rain pounded on the roof, and the wind howled outside. I felt a bit uneasy, but it was better than being out in the storm. I decided to make a small fire to warm up and dry off. As I was gathering some old wood from a pile in the corner, I noticed something odd. There were fresh food wrappers and an empty water bottle under the table. It looked like someone had been here recently. My heart started to race. What if they came back? I tried to calm myself, thinking it could have been a hiker like me, seeking shelter from the rain. I lit the fire and warmed my hands. The small flickering flames cast shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel even more eerie. I decided to stay close to the door, just in case. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and it was getting darker. I sat in the chair, trying to relax, but every creak and groan of the cabin made me jump. A loud noise from outside made me freeze. I turned off my flashlight and listened. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Panic set in. I looked around for a place to hide. There was a small closet near the back wall. I grabbed my things and slipped inside, closing the door as quietly as I could. I could hear voices now, muffled by the rain. Two men, talking and laughing. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. They stomped inside, shaking off the rain. I peeked through a crack in the closet door and saw them clearly. They were big, rough-looking men, and they carried guns. They started talking about a deal, something about money and a meeting place. My heart pounded in my chest. These weren't just hikers. They were criminals. I was trapped in their hideout, and they had no idea I was there. I needed to get out, but how? One of the men walked over to the fireplace, noticing the warm embers. "Someone's been here," he said, his voice gruff. My stomach dropped. They knew. I tried to stay as still and quiet as possible, but my mind was racing. What would they do if they found me? The other man cursed and started looking around. I could hear them opening drawers and moving things. They were getting closer to the closet. I pressed myself against the back wall, praying they wouldn't find me. The door handle turned, and I held my breath. The door swung open, and I saw the man's face. He froze for a second, then his eyes widened. "What the hell?" he shouted, reaching for me. I didn't think, just acted. I shoved past him, knocking him off balance, and ran for the door. The other man shouted and lunged at me, but I ducked and sprinted out into the rain. I didn't look back. I just ran. The rain was blinding, and the forest was dark, but I kept going. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the trees, shouting. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out, but I didn't stop. I needed to find help, get away from them. I stumbled down a hill, slipping in the mud, and crashed into a stream. The cold water shocked me, but I kept going, following the stream, hoping it would lead me to safety. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, and I risked a glance back. They weren't there. I kept moving, more carefully now, trying to stay hidden. The stream led to a dirt road, and I followed it, praying for a car or a house, anything. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights. I waved frantically, and the car stopped. It was a ranger. I told him everything, barely able to speak from exhaustion and fear. He took me to the nearest station, where I finally felt safe. They never found the men or the cabin. I still think about that night, how close I came to being caught. I haven't been back to the woods since. I pulled into a rest stop late one night, trying to wait out the heavy rainstorm. The rain was coming down in sheets, making it hard to see the road. I figured I'd be safer waiting it out rather than risking a drive in such bad weather. The rest stop was nearly empty, just a couple of other cars parked under the dim lights. As I settled in, I noticed a car that had been following me closely for the last few miles also pull in. It was an old, beat-up sedan, and something about it made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just being paranoid. I reclined my seat and closed my eyes, hoping to get some rest. After a few minutes, I heard a noise outside. I sat up and saw the man from the sedan standing by my truck. He was staring at me through the rain, his face partly hidden by a hood. My heart started to race. I rolled down the window slightly to ask if he needed help, but before I could say anything, he was already walking towards my door. I stepped out of the truck, and the rain immediately soaked me to the bone. The man moved closer, and I could see his face more clearly now. He had a cold, hard look in his eyes. He demanded that I transport some illegal goods for him, and he wasn't asking. He had a gun tucked into his waistband, and he made sure I saw it. I tried to refuse, but he grabbed my arm and squeezed hard. He told me that if I didn't do what he said, I wouldn't be leaving the rest stop alive. I could feel the blood drain from my face. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to get involved in whatever he was doing, but I also didn't want to get shot. He dragged me over to his car and opened the trunk. Inside were several black duffel bags. He told me to load them into my truck. As I lifted the first bag, I felt how heavy it was. My mind raced, thinking about what could be inside. Drugs? Weapons? Whatever it wasn't good. I loaded the bags into my truck, the rain making it hard to see and even harder to think straight. Once the last bag was in, the man told me to follow him. We got into our vehicles, and he led me out of the rest stop and back onto the highway. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, hoping for a police car or any sign of help, but there was nothing. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only about 30 minutes. He led me down a series of back roads, each one more desolate than the last. Finally, we pulled into a dark, abandoned warehouse. My heart pounded in my chest as we parked. The man got out and motioned for me to do the same. He pointed to a side door and told me to take the bags inside. I hesitated for a moment, but he pulled out his gun and waved it at me, so I grabbed the bags and walked towards the door. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out of this. Inside the warehouse, it was dark and cold. The man followed me in, keeping the gun trained on me. He directed me to a corner where a couple of other men were waiting. They looked just as rough and mean as the first guy. I set the bags down, and one of the men opened them to inspect the contents. I couldn't see what was inside, but whatever it was seemed to satisfy them. The man with the gun told me to leave. He said if I ever mentioned this to anyone, they'd find me and kill me. I nodded, trying to hide how terrified I was. I backed out of the warehouse, got into my truck, and drove away as fast as I could. The rain had let up a bit, but my hands were still shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached a busy gas station miles away. I parked under the bright lights and took a deep breath. I called the police and told them everything. It was late, and the rain was coming down hard. I could barely see the road through my windshield. My gas gauge was almost on empty, so I pulled into the first gas station I saw. It was nearly deserted, just one other car parked under the awning. The station looked old and run down, but it was my only option. I got out of my car and ran to the door, trying to avoid getting too wet. The inside was dimly lit, and the smell of old coffee hung in the air. The attendant was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, with a friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He greeted me as I came in. "Rough night, huh?" he said, his voice gravelly. "Yeah, just need some gas," I replied, trying to be polite but not really wanting to engage in conversation. "Sure thing. Pumps on. Pay when you're done." I nodded and headed back out to fill up my car. The rain was relentless, soaking me in seconds. I hurried back inside once the tank was full. I handed the man a 20 and waited for my change. As he fiddled with the cash register, I glanced around. The place was cluttered with old magazines, dusty shelves, and a faint hum of fluorescent lights. It gave me an uneasy feeling. Then, I heard the sound of a lock clicking. I looked over and saw the attendant turning the key in the front door. My stomach dropped. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just locking up for the night," he said, but his tone was different now. Less friendly. More menacing. "I need to go," I said, moving toward the door. He stepped in front of me, blocking my way. "I don't think so," he said. "Why don't you stay a while? We can have a little chat." Panic surged through me. I backed away, looking for another way out. The windows were barred, and there was only one other door behind the counter. I had to think fast. "Please, I just want to leave," I pleaded, hoping to reason with him. He shook his head slowly, a creepy smile spreading across his face. "You're not going anywhere." I glanced at the counter, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. There was a metal coffee pot within reach. I grabbed it and swung it at him. It hit his arm, and he stumbled back, cursing. I took my chance and bolted for the door behind the counter. I pushed through and found myself in a small storage room. Boxes were piled high, and there was a faint smell of mildew. I frantically searched for another exit, but there was none. Footsteps approached, and I knew I didn't have much time. I spotted a metal shelf and shoved it against the door, hoping it would buy me some time. The door rattled as he tried to push it open. I could hear him shouting, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart was pounding in my chest. I had to find a way out. I spotted a small window high up on the wall. It was my only chance. I climbed onto a stack of boxes and pushed at the window. It was stuck, but I used all my strength to force it open. The gap was small, but I managed to squeeze through. I dropped to the ground outside, the rain still pouring down. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I finally got the door open and jumped inside, locking the doors behind me. I started the car and peeled out of the gas station, my tires skidding on the wet pavement. In the rearview mirror, I saw the attendant standing in the doorway, watching me with that same eerie smile. I didn't stop driving until I reached a busy highway. My heart was still racing, and I felt like I might be sick. I pulled over at a well-lit rest stop and called the police. I told them everything, but I didn't know if they would find him. I just wanted to get as far away from the place as possible. The rest of the drive was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that old sedan following me. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in the dark, trying to calm down. I don't know what that man's plans were, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that I'll never stop at a deserted gas station again. It was a night like any other, except for the storm. The rain hammered against the windows, and the thunder seemed to shake the whole house. I was home alone, trying to finish some work in the living room. The power went out suddenly, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to find my way around. I lit a few candles and placed them around the room, the flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt a bit uneasy but chalked it up to the storm. The wind howled outside, and the old house creaked and groaned. I decided to go to bed, hoping the power would be back by morning. As I climbed the stairs, I heard a noise coming from downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the storm, but then I heard it again. A faint thud, like something being knocked over. My heart started to race. I knew every sound this house made, and this was different. I paused on the stairs, straining to hear. There it was again, louder this time. Someone was in my house. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. I crept back downstairs, my footsteps barely making a sound. I had to see what was going on. As I reached the bottom, I peered around the corner into the living room. The candles were still burning, casting long shadows. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone was in the kitchen. I picked up a heavy vase from a side table, gripping it tightly. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was in the kitchen would hear it. I inched closer, trying to stay out of sight. I could hear rummaging, the sound of drawers being opened and closed. I took a deep breath and stepped into the kitchen, raising the vase above my head. The figure turned, and our eyes met. He was a large man, dressed in dark clothes, his face partially covered by a hood. He didn't seem startled to see me, just annoyed. "Who are you? What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer, just took a step toward me. I swung the vase, but he was quicker. He grabbed my wrist, twisting it painfully until I dropped the vase. It shattered on the floor, the sound echoing through the house. He pushed me back, and I stumbled, falling to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, backing away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. The dim candlelight glinted off the blade. I felt a surge of panic. "Get out of my house!" I shouted, but he just smiled, a cold, sinister smile. I turned and ran, my bare feet slipping on the wooden floor. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. I made it to the stairs and took them two at a time, my only thought to get to my bedroom and lock the door. I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. I could hear him coming up the stairs. I looked around for something to defend myself with. My eyes fell on the heavy dresser. I pushed it in front of the door, using all my strength. The doorknob rattled, and I heard him cursing. He started pounding on the door, the wood splintering under the force. I knew it wouldn't hold for long. I looked around the room, desperate for another way out. The only window was too high to jump from safely. I grabbed a lamp and stood by the door, ready to defend myself. The door burst open, the dresser shoved aside like it weighed nothing. He stepped into the room, knife in hand. I swung the lamp, catching him on the side of the head. He staggered, but didn't go down. He lunged at me, and I swung again, this time hitting his arm. The knife flew out of his hand, clattering to the floor. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I grabbed the knife and backed away, keeping it between us. "Leave now, or I'll use this," I warned, my voice steadier than I felt. He eyed the knife, then me, and for a moment, I thought he might listen. But then he lunged at me again. I slashed at him, catching him across the chest. He screamed in pain, but it only seemed to make him angrier. He tackled me, and we both went down. The knife slipped from my hand, and we wrestled on the floor. He was stronger, but I was fueled by pure adrenaline. I managed to get a knee into his stomach, pushing him off me. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the knife again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stabbed him in the leg, putting all my strength into it. He howled in pain, clutching his leg. I ran past him, out of the room, and down the stairs. I made it to the front door and yanked it open, running out into the storm. The rain was still pouring, but I didn't care. I ran to my neighbor's house, banging on the door. They let me in, and I called the police. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. They searched the house, but there was no sign of him. They said he must have been a drifter, looking for an easy target. But I knew it was more than that. He had planned this. I never spent another night alone in that house. I was driving alone on a long stretch of highway. The rain started coming down harder, making it difficult to see. The windshield wipers were going full speed, but it didn't seem to help much. The road was nearly deserted, and I felt a bit uneasy. It was the kind of night that made you wish you weren't alone. I saw a figure on the side of the road, drenched and holding out a thumb. Normally, I wouldn't pick up a hitchhiker, but the weather was awful, and I felt a pang of sympathy. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked. He smiled, his face partly hidden by the hood of his jacket. "Yes, please. It's miserable out here." He climbed in, bringing a wave of cold, wet air with him. I turned up the heat and started driving again. We exchanged small talk at first. His name was Mike. He seemed friendly enough, talking about the weather and his bad luck with his car breaking down. I felt more relaxed with him in the car, the company breaking the monotony of the drive. But as the rain got heavier, something in his demeanor changed. His responses became shorter, his tone more serious. I tried to keep the conversation going, but it felt forced. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. Suddenly, he reached over and locked the car doors. I glanced at him, my heart starting to race. "Why did you do that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "For safety," he replied, but there was something unsettling in his voice. He turned to face me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Keep driving." Fear gripped me. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He pulled a knife from his jacket and held it up where I could see it. "Just keep driving," he said calmly. "And don't do anything stupid." My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The rain was pounding on the roof, the road a blur in the headlights. I had to stay calm, had to think. "Where are we going?" I asked, hoping to buy some time. "There's a rest area a few miles up the road." "Pull in there," he ordered. I nodded, trying to keep my breathing steady. The rest area wasn't far, and I had to find a way to escape before we got there. I kept glancing at the road, looking for any opportunity. The rain made it hard to see, but I noticed a small dirt road coming up on the right. Without warning, I yanked the wheel and turned onto the dirt road. The car skidded in the mud, and Mike cursed, grabbing the dashboard for support. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted. I didn't answer. I just kept driving, the car bouncing and sliding on the rough road. I could hear him fumbling with the knife, trying to steady himself. The dirt road wound through the trees, and I hoped it would lead to somewhere safe. "Stop the car," he demanded, his voice full of anger. He lunged at me, and I swerved, trying to throw him off balance. The knife grazed my arm, and I cried out in pain. I slammed on the brakes, the car sliding to a stop. I grabbed my bleeding arm and looked at him. He was panting, the knife still in his hand. "Get out," he ordered, pointing the knife at me. I didn't move. "Please, just let me go," I pleaded. He shook his head. "Get out," he repeated, more forcefully. I slowly opened the door and stepped out into the rain. It was freezing, the water soaking through my clothes instantly. Mike got out on his side, keeping the knife pointed at me. "Walk," he said, nodding toward the trees. I started walking, my mind racing. The rain was so heavy I could barely see a few feet ahead. I had to find a way to escape, to get away from him. He was right behind me, the knife glinting in the dim light. We walked for what felt like hours, the mud sucking at my shoes, the rain relentless. My arm throbbed where he had cut me, and I was starting to feel dizzy. I had to do something, had to find a way to get away. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a rustling in the trees. I stopped, turning to look. Mike grabbed my arm, pulling me forward. "Keep moving," he snapped. But the noise came again, closer this time. It sounded like footsteps. I glanced around, trying to see through the rain. "Someone's coming," I said, hoping it was true. Mike looked around, his grip on my arm tightening. "Shut up," he hissed. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could see a light bobbing through the trees. Mike cursed, pulling me toward the car. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice panicked. I saw my chance. I twisted out of his grip and ran toward the light, screaming for help. "Help! Please, help me!" The light stopped, and I heard a voice call out. "Who's there?" Mike was right behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, the mud and rain slowing me down. I could hear him cursing, struggling to keep up. I burst through the trees and saw a figure holding a flashlight. It was a man, a hunter by the looks of it. "Help me!" I cried, running toward him. He looked confused for a moment, then saw Mike coming after me. He raised the flashlight, shining it in Mike's face. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Mike stopped, the knife still in his hand. "Just a misunderstanding," he said, trying to sound calm. "The hunter wasn't buying it." He raised his rifle, pointing it at Mike. "Drop the knife," he ordered. Mike hesitated, then dropped the knife in the mud. The hunter kept the rifle trained on him, his eyes narrowing. "You okay, miss?" he asked me. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you," I whispered. The hunter kept the rifle on Mike as he called the police. They arrived quickly, taking Mike into custody. I was safe, but I knew I would never forget that night, the terror and the rain. I would never pick up a hitchhiker again. Not even for $1 million. My shift ended late that night. I was exhausted and just wanted to get home. It was pouring rain, and I didn't have an umbrella. I pulled my hood over my head and started walking through the alley I usually took as a shortcut. The alley was dark and empty, the rain drowning out most sounds. I hurried, eager to get out of the wet and into my warm apartment. About halfway down the alley, I noticed 2 figures standing by a van. At first, I didn't think much of it. People often parked there to avoid the main street. As I got closer, the 2 men looked up and stared at me. Something in their eyes made me uneasy, but I kept walking, trying to act natural. Suddenly, one of them moved toward me. Before I could react, he grabbed my arm. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. The other men joined him, and together they dragged me toward the van. I shouted for help, but the rain and the alley's isolation swallowed my cries. They shoved me into the van and slammed the door shut. Inside, it was dark and smelled of gasoline and damp cloth. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced. What did they want with me? How could I get out of this? The van started moving. I could hear the men talking in low voices, but I couldn't make out the words. I needed to stay calm and think. I knew the city well, every street and shortcut. If I could get out of the van, I might have a chance. I felt around in the darkness, trying to find something, anything, that could help me. My hand brushed against a metal tool. I grabbed it, holding it tightly. The van made a sharp turn, and I was thrown against the side. I waited, listening for any sign of where we might be. After what felt like an eternity, the van slowed down and came to a stop. I heard the men getting out. I knew this was my chance. I quickly moved to the back of the van and felt for the latch. It was old and rusty, but I managed to open it. I peeked out and saw we were in a deserted parking lot. The men were walking away, talking animatedly. I slipped out of the van and quietly closed the door. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. I recognized a building in the distance. I knew where I was. It wasn't far from a busy street. If I could make it there, I might be safe. I moved quickly but quietly, keeping to the shadows. The rain was still coming down hard, but it helped mask my movements. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting them to notice I was gone at any moment. I reached the edge of the parking lot and saw the lights of the main street up ahead. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't let my guard down yet. I crossed the lot and slipped into an alley that would take me directly to the main street. Halfway down the alley, I heard shouts behind me. They had realized I was gone. Panic surged through me, and I started running. My shoes slipped on the wet pavement, and I nearly fell, but I kept going. I had to make it to the street. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, I saw the lights of the main street ahead. I burst out of the alley and into the busy road. Cars sped by, and people walked under umbrellas. I ran to the nearest store and pushed my way inside. The warmth and light of the store were overwhelming. I looked around, trying to catch my breath. The cashier stared at me in shock. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Call the police," I managed to say between gasps. "I've been kidnapped." She grabbed the phone and dialed. I sank to the floor, the adrenaline leaving my body. The police arrived quickly. I told them everything, from the moment I was grabbed to my escape. They took my statement and assured me they would find the men. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, felt their hands grabbing me. But I was safe. I had escaped. The rain had finally stopped, and the city was quiet again. I decided to go for a solo hike on the Appalachian Trail. It was supposed to be a way to clear my mind. The weather forecast said it would be clear, but the sky started to darken in the late afternoon. By the time I realized I was in trouble, it was too late to turn back. The rain started pouring down, heavy and relentless. I lost my bearings as the trail turned to mud, making it hard to see or move. I thought I was prepared, but I wasn't ready for a storm like this. My map was useless, soaked through and tearing apart in my hands. My phone had no signal, and my flashlight barely cut through the dark. Every step I took seemed to lead me further from the trail. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint light in the distance. I hoped it was a shelter or another hiker. As I got closer, I saw it was a small campsite. Relief washed over me until I saw the men. There were 4 of them, gathered around a fire, their faces hidden in the shadows. They looked rough, not like the friendly hikers I usually met. I approached cautiously, calling out a greeting. They turned to look at me, their expressions hard to read. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard, stood up and walked toward me. He had a strange look in his eyes. "Lost, are you?" he asked. His voice was deep and unfriendly. "Yeah, I got caught in the storm and lost the trail," I said, trying to sound calm. "Do you know how to get back?" He glanced back at his friends, then back at me. "You can stay here for the night," he said. "We can help you in the morning." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. But I was cold, wet, and tired, and I didn't see any other options. I nodded and thanked him. They gave me a spot near the fire, but the warmth did little to ease my unease. As the night wore on, the men talked among themselves in low voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they kept glancing at me. I pretended not to notice, focusing on drying my clothes and warming my hands. At one point, I got up to stretch my legs and noticed one of the men, a short guy with a scar on his cheek, following me with his eyes. I went to the edge of the camp to get some privacy, but he followed me. My heart started to race. "You all right?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes cold. "Just needed some air," I said, trying to stay calm. "I'll head back to the fire." He nodded but didn't move. I walked back, feeling his eyes on me the whole time. I knew then that I had to get out of there. But how? The storm was still raging, and I had no idea where the trail was. I waited until they seemed to be settling down for the night. They had a makeshift tent and some sleeping bags. I pretended to doze off by the fire, but I kept one eye open, watching them. When their breathing got steady, I made my move. I grabbed my backpack and slipped away into the dark. The rain had let up a bit, but the night was pitch black. I moved as quietly as I could, every step feeling like it echoed in the stillness. I didn't dare use my flashlight, afraid it would give me away. I had no idea where I was going, just away from them. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like hours, I heard voices behind me. They had woken up and noticed I was gone. Panic set in. I ran, not caring about the noise anymore. The forest seemed endless, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them. I tripped and fell, scraping my knees and hands, but I forced myself up and kept going. Eventually, I saw a light through the trees. It looked like a cabin or a ranger station. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning, and burst through the door without knocking. Inside, a ranger looked up, startled. I must have looked a mess, soaked and muddy, but I managed to explain what had happened. He radioed for backup, and soon other rangers arrived. They went out to find the men while I stayed behind, shaking with fear and relief. They found the campsite, but the men were gone. The rangers escorted me back to safety, and I reported everything. I never found out who those men were or what they intended, but I knew I had narrowly escaped something terrible. Since then, I've never hiked alone again, especially not on a stormy night. I left work late that night, the rain pouring down hard. The office was almost empty when I stepped out, and the streets were quiet. I hurried to the parking garage, my coat barely keeping me dry. The sound of the rain hitting the pavement was loud, but I noticed something else. Footsteps behind me. I glanced back and saw a figure, just a shadow in the dim light. I quickened my pace, my heart starting to race. I told myself it was nothing, just someone else trying to get out of the storm. But the footsteps matched my speed. The parking garage was dark and mostly empty, just a few cars scattered around. I headed for my car, parked in a corner on the second level. The footsteps got louder, closer. I reached my car and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking. As I unlocked the door, I saw him out of the corner of my eye. A man, drenched from the rain, his face obscured by a hood. He was walking straight towards me. I jumped into the car and locked the doors, my breath coming in short gasps. He reached my window and knocked on it, hard. I could see his face now, pale and expressionless. "Open the door," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. I shook my head, my hands gripping the steering wheel. He pounded on the window again, harder this time. "Open the door," he repeated, more forcefully. I started the car, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. As I put the car in reverse, he moved to the back, blocking my way. I hesitated, not wanting to hit him, but he didn't move. Suddenly, he pulled something from his coat. A crowbar. He swung it at the window, shattering the glass. I screamed and hit the gas, the car lurching backward. He jumped out of the way, and I sped out of the parking spot, my tires squealing on the wet concrete. I didn't look back as I drove down the ramp, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the exit and turned onto the street, the rain coming down even harder now. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see him following me. I drove straight to the police station, my hands still shaking. I ran inside and told them everything. They took my statement and sent a patrol car to the garage, but they didn't find him. They said they would keep an eye out, but I knew he was gone. I went home that night, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard the sound of the crowbar hitting the window. I kept thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't gotten away. The next day, I called my boss and told him what happened. He understood and let me work from home for a while. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that garage. I started taking extra precautions, always looking over my shoulder, always making sure I wasn't being followed. The police never caught him, and I never saw him again. It was pouring rain that night, the kind of rain that makes it hard to see even with the wipers on full speed. I was driving back home from my mom's place with my daughter, Lily, in the back seat. The road was slick, and the wind was howling through the trees lining the narrow road. We were about 10 miles from home when the car suddenly skidded. I tried to correct the steering, but it was too late. The car slid off the road and into a ditch, sinking into the mud with a sickening thud. Lily was scared but unhurt, thank God. I tried to drive out, but the tires just spun in the mud. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I told Lily to stay in the car while I checked if there was any way to get the car moving. As I stepped out, the rain drenched me instantly. The mud was thick and sticky, clinging to my shoes with every step. I was inspecting the tires when I saw headlights approaching. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe they could help pull us out. The car stopped, and a man stepped out. He was tall and had a hood pulled over his head, making it hard to see his face. "Need some help?" he called out over the sound of the rain. "Yes, please," I replied. "My car's stuck in the mud. Can you help us?" He walked over, and as he got closer, I felt a strange sense of unease. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. But I was desperate. "I have a rope in my truck," he said. "I can pull you out." He went back to his truck, and I turned to check on Lily. She was watching from the back seat, her wide eyes filled with worry. I tried to smile reassuringly, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The man came back with a rope and started attaching it to the front of my car. He worked in silence, his movements quick and precise. Once he was done, he got back into his truck and started pulling. The car lurched forward, but it didn't budge much. The mud was too deep. He got out of the truck again and walked over. "It's not working," he said, his tone flat. "We'll need to try something else." I nodded, unsure of what to say. He walked closer, and I noticed a glint in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. "Why don't you and the kid come wait in my truck? It's warm and dry." Something about his suggestion set off alarm bells in my head. "No, we're fine," I said quickly. "We'll stay here." His expression darkened. "It's not safe out here," he insisted, stepping closer. "You need to come with me." I took a step back, my heart pounding. "No, thank you," I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll be fine." He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. "I'm not asking," he growled. "You're coming with me." Panic surged through me. I twisted out of his grip and ran to the car, locking the doors behind me. Lily was crying, and I tried to calm her down while fumbling for my phone. Still no signal. The man was pounding on the window now, shouting for me to open the door. I ignored him and started the car, hoping against hope that we could somehow get free. The tires spun uselessly, and I felt tears of frustration and fear welling up. Then, a miracle. Another set of headlights appeared down the road. The man stopped pounding and turned to face the new car. I honked the horn desperately, hoping to get their attention. The car stopped, and two men got out. They looked from me to the man and seemed to understand the situation immediately. "Is there a problem here?" one of them called out. The man backed away from the window, muttering something under his breath. He glanced at me one last time, his eyes full of anger, before walking back to his truck. He drove off without another word. The two men walked over to my car. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. I nodded, still shaken. "Yes, thank you." He was trying to get us to go with him. They looked at each other and then back at me. "Let's get you out of here," the other man said. They hooked up their truck to my car and managed to pull it free from the mud. Once we were back on the road, I thanked them repeatedly. They offered to follow us home to make sure we got there safely, and I gratefully accepted. Lily was still scared, but I promised her we were safe now. We made it home without any further incidents. I never found out who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm grateful to those two men who showed up when they did. The rain was coming down in sheets that night, drumming on the roof of my car as I pulled up to the old, abandoned warehouse. My job was to guard the place overnight, make sure no one broke in or did anything illegal. It seemed simple enough, but the storm added an eerie feel to the whole thing. I parked and grabbed my flashlight, pulling my coat tighter against the wind. The warehouse loomed in front of me, its broken windows and crumbling walls barely visible through the rain. I took a deep breath and headed inside, my boots squelching in the mud. Inside, the place was dark and cold. The only light came from my flashlight, which cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. The air was musty, and every sound seemed to echo. I checked the main floor first, making sure all the doors and windows were secure. Everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I moved to the second floor, the stairs creaking under my weight. As I reached the top, I heard it, a faint noise coming from somewhere below. It sounded like whispers, or maybe the rustling of clothes. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding rain. The noise came again, clearer this time. Voices, definitely voices. I turned off my flashlight and crouched down, trying to stay hidden. The last thing I wanted was to confront whoever was down there without knowing how many there were. I made my way back to the stairs, moving as quietly as I could. The voices were louder now, coming from the far end of the warehouse. I crept closer, staying low and out of sight. As I peered around a corner, I saw them, a group of men, at least 4 or 5, huddled together and talking in low tones. They had crates stacked around them, and one of them was prying one open with a crowbar. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They were using the warehouse as a hideout. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to get out and call for backup. I turned to leave, but my foot caught on a loose board. It creaked loudly, and I froze. The voices stopped, and I heard one of the men say, "Did you hear that?" Panic surged through me. I couldn't stay hidden here, and I couldn't make a run for it without them hearing. I spotted a small door to my left and slipped through it, finding myself in a narrow hallway. I moved quickly, looking for another way out. The hallway led to a small office. I ducked inside and shut the door quietly behind me. There was a window, but it was too high to climb through. I could hear the men moving around, their footsteps echoing in the empty warehouse. They were looking for me. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking. No signal. Of course. I needed to get outside, but the only way out was back through the warehouse. I listened at the door, trying to gauge where they were. They were getting closer. I had to think fast. There was an old desk in the office, and I squeezed underneath it, pulling a chair in front to hide myself. My breathing was loud in my ears, and I struggled to stay calm. The footsteps were right outside the door now. The door creaked open, and a beam of light swept the room. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The light passed over the desk, and I heard one of them say, "Nothing here. Let's check the next room." The door closed, and their footsteps faded. I waited a few moments before crawling out from under the desk. I had to get out before they came back. I opened the door a crack and peered out. The hallway was empty. I moved quickly, heading back the way I came. The voices were distant now, coming from the other end of the warehouse. I reached the stairs and hurried down, keeping my flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. I was almost to the main door when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw one of the men, his flashlight beam catching me in its glare. "Hey!" he shouted. I bolted, my heart racing. I could hear him chasing me, his footsteps pounding on the concrete floor. I burst through the door and into the rain, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I ran for my car, fumbling for my keys. I could hear the man shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I reached the car, yanked the door open, and jumped inside. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, the tires slipping on the wet road. I drove until I found a spot with a signal and called the police. My hands were still shaking as I explained what had happened. They promised to send a unit out right away. I waited in my car, the rain still pounding down, until I saw the flashing lights of the police cars. They went in, and a few minutes later, they came out with the men in handcuffs. One of the officers came over to my car and told me it was safe now. I thanked him and drove home, my mind still reeling from the night's events. I knew I'd have to go back to the warehouse the next day, but for now, I was just grateful to be safe. It was pouring rain when I left the office that night. The storm had been building all day, and now it was a full-blown downpour. I hurried to my car, huddling under my umbrella, and saw Tom standing at the entrance. He looked soaked, even with his raincoat on. "Need a ride?" I called out. Tom smiled, relieved. "Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it." He climbed into the passenger seat, and I cranked up the heat. We chatted about work as I navigated the slick roads. The rain was so heavy, it was hard to see beyond a few feet. The wipers were working overtime, but it barely made a difference. We came to a red light, and I glanced over at Tom. He seemed tense, his fingers drumming on his knee. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded, but didn't say anything. The light turned green, and I started to drive. A few blocks later, I noticed Tom wasn't in the car anymore. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard the door open or felt any movement. I pulled over, panic rising. How could he just disappear? I got out, looking around, calling his name. The rain was relentless, soaking me in seconds. There was no sign of him anywhere. I got back in the car, my mind racing. Did he jump out? Why didn't I hear anything? I decided to head back to the office, thinking maybe he had gone back there for some reason. When I arrived, the building was dark and locked up. I knocked on the door, hoping the night guard might have seen something. No answer. I was alone. I drove around the area, circling the blocks near where he vanished, but there was no sign of Tom. Feeling desperate, I called the police. They said they would send someone out to take a report, but their tone made it clear they thought he probably just decided to walk home. I sat in my car, shivering from the cold and the fear. Something was very wrong. I decided to go to Tom's apartment, hoping he might be there. When I got there, his lights were off. I banged on his door, but no one answered. As I turned to leave, a figure stepped out of the shadows. I jumped, recognizing one of Tom's neighbors. He looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You looking for Tom?" he asked. I nodded. "Have you seen him?" He shook his head. "Not since this morning." "Is something wrong?" I explained what had happened, and he looked even more worried. "Tom's been acting strange lately. He mentioned something about being followed, but I thought he was just stressed from work." The rain kept pounding down as I got back into my car. My phone rang, and I saw it was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Rachel," a voice said. It was Tom, but he sounded scared. "Tom, where are you?" "I don't have much time." "Don't trust them," he whispered. The line went dead. My hands were shaking as I tried to call him back, but it went straight to voicemail. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I couldn't go to the police. They wouldn't believe me. I drove around aimlessly, trying to piece together what little I knew. My thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a black car that seemed to be following me. Every turn I made, it was right there behind me. Panic set in. I took a sharp turn down a side street and sped up, hoping to lose them. My heart was pounding as I navigated the narrow, rain-slicked roads. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the car still behind me. I drove towards the outskirts of town, hoping the winding roads would help me shake them. The car was relentless, though, staying on my tail. I saw a narrow dirt road and turned onto it, the car bouncing over the rough terrain. The road led into a dense forest. The trees closed in around me, and the headlights of the car behind me disappeared. I kept driving until I found a small clearing, then turned off my engine and lights, hoping they wouldn't find me. I sat there in the dark, the rain hammering on the roof, trying to calm my racing heart. I had to figure out what was happening and why Tom had disappeared. I couldn't go home, it wasn't safe. After what felt like hours, the rain finally started to let up. I decided to head back to town, keeping to the back roads. I needed answers, and the only place I could think of was Tom's apartment. When I arrived, the building was dark and quiet. I snuck in through a side door that I knew was always left unlocked. I crept up to Tom's apartment and picked the lock, a skill I had learned years ago and never thought I'd need. Inside, the place was a mess. Papers were scattered everywhere, and it looked like someone had been searching for something. I found Tom's laptop on the table and opened it, hoping for a clue. As I searched through his files, I found a folder marked Danger. Inside were documents and photos detailing some kind of conspiracy. There were pictures of people I recognized from around town, notes about meetings, and lists of names. It was all connected to some illegal activities that Tom had uncovered. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside the door. I quickly closed the laptop and hid behind the couch. The door creaked open, and I saw a pair of boots step inside. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The person moved around the apartment, searching through the mess. After what felt like an eternity, they left, and I heard the door lock behind them. I waited a few minutes before coming out of my hiding spot. I grabbed Tom's laptop and slipped out of the apartment, heading back to my car. I needed to find a safe place to go through the files and figure out who I could trust. I drove to a nearby motel and checked in under a fake name. In the safety of my room, I opened the laptop again and went through everything. It was clear that Tom had stumbled onto something big, and now we were both targets. I knew I had to get this information to someone who could help, but I had to be careful. I spent the rest of the night making copies of the files and sending them to trusted contacts, hoping they would take it seriously. As dawn approached, I felt a little safer. The storm had passed, but I knew the danger wasn't over. I had to stay hidden until I could be sure the information was out and Tom was safe. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I moved from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long. I heard from one of my contacts that the information had been leaked to the press, and the authorities were investigating. Finally, I got a call from Tom. He was safe, hiding out in a different city. He thanked me for helping him, and we agreed to lay low until things blew over. It took months for the dust to settle, but eventually, the people behind the conspiracy were arrested, and things started to go back to normal. I never saw Tom again, but we kept in touch through encrypted messages. That rainy night changed everything. I learned to be more cautious, to trust my instincts, and to always be aware of my surroundings. It was late, and the rain was coming down hard, turning the roads into slick, black mirrors. I had stayed late at the office, trying to finish a project that was due the next day. When I finally got out, the parking lot was nearly empty. I climbed into my car, exhausted, and started the drive home. The rain was relentless, the kind that makes it hard to see even with the wipers on full blast. I took it slow, barely able to make out the lines on the road. As I drove through the quiet streets, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another car up late like me, I figured. But then, the car got closer. Much closer. I could see the outline of the vehicle in my mirror, the headlights almost blinding. I changed lanes, hoping they would pass, but they followed. My heart started to race. Maybe it was just a coincidence, I thought, trying to calm myself. I took a right turn onto a side street, thinking they would keep going straight. They didn't. They turned with me. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I tried to shake them off, making a series of random turns, but they matched each one. The car got even closer, almost bumper to bumper. The driver flashed their eye beams, making it impossible to see. Panic set in. I sped up, my tires skidding on the wet pavement. They did the same, their car swerving dangerously close to mine. I needed to find a safe place to pull over and call for help. I scanned the streets for any sign of life, but it was late, and the rain had driven everyone inside. The streets were deserted. I thought about pulling into a gas station, but there weren't any around. My mind raced through options, trying to come up with a plan. I saw a sign for the highway up ahead and decided to take it. Maybe I could lose them with the higher speed and more traffic. I floored it, the engine roaring as I merged onto the highway. The other car stayed right behind me, now swerving side to side, trying to push me off the road. My hands were shaking, and I struggled to keep control of the car. The rain was so heavy, it was like driving through a waterfall. I prayed for a police car, any sign of help. Nothing. The highway was as empty as the streets had been. The car behind me rammed into my bumper, sending a jolt through my body. I fought to keep the car steady. Another hit. I could hear the crunch of metal. I had to do something. I couldn't keep going like this. Up ahead, I saw an exit sign. It led to a more populated area. I decided to take it, hoping the streetlights and buildings would provide some safety. I took the exit at high speed, the tires screeching as I turned. The other car followed, still trying to ram me off the road. I sped through the streets, looking for any place that was open. I saw a 24-hour diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the rain. I aimed for it, praying the other car wouldn't follow me inside. I pulled into the parking lot, my tires sliding on the wet pavement. I jumped out of the car and ran for the door. The diner was nearly empty, just a couple of people inside. The waitress looked up, startled, as I burst through the door, drenched and panting. "Call the police." I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "Someone's trying to kill me." She grabbed the phone, her eyes wide with shock. I turned to look outside. The car had stopped at the entrance to the parking lot. The driver sat there, engine running, headlights glaring into the diner. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me. The police arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. The car sped off as soon as they pulled in. I gave the officers my statement, describing the car and what had happened. They promised to patrol the area and keep an eye out, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I called a friend to pick me up, too shaken to drive home. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that the driver would come back. Every car that passed made me jump. When my friend arrived, I felt a wave of relief but knew I wouldn't feel safe for a long time. The police never found the car or the driver. I changed my routes, always looking over my shoulder, always on edge. I arrived at the Airbnb late, the rain pouring down in sheets. It had been a long drive, and all I wanted was to get inside and dry off. The place looked cozy in the pictures, and when I finally pulled up, it seemed all right. A small cottage tucked away from the main road, lights glowing warmly inside. I grabbed my bags and hurried to the door. The owner, Paul, greeted me. He seemed friendly enough, though there was something about his smile that made me uneasy. I brushed it off as paranoia. It had been a stressful week. I thanked him, took the keys, and stepped inside. The place was charming, just like the photos. Rustic furniture, a fireplace, and the soft patter of rain on the roof. I unpacked my things and tried to relax, but the unease lingered. I chalked it up to the storm outside and decided to take a shower. After I finished, I went to lock the front door. That's when I noticed it. The lock was on the outside. My heart skipped a beat. I checked the other doors and windows. All of them had the same setup. Locks on the outside, none on the inside. Panic set in. I tried calling Paul, but my phone had no signal. The Wi-Fi wasn't working either. I felt trapped. The rain pounded harder, and the wind howled through the trees. I needed to think. I needed to find a way out without letting him know I was onto him. I remembered seeing a small window in the bathroom that might be big enough to crawl through. Quietly, I made my way there. I tried opening it, but it was painted shut. I started to panic again, but I knew I had to stay calm. I looked around for something to break the glass. There was a heavy candle holder on the sink. I grabbed it and, with a silent prayer, swung it at the window. The glass shattered, and I froze, listening for any signs that Paul had heard. Nothing. I cleared away the shards and tried to squeeze through. It was a tight fit, but I managed to get my upper body out. That's when I heard footsteps. I scrambled, pushing myself the rest of the way out. I fell into the mud outside, the rain soaking me instantly. I didn't have time to think about it. I got up and ran. The trees were dense, and the darkness made it hard to see. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard a door slam behind me and knew Paul was coming. I had to keep moving. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. I found a small clearing and hid behind a fallen log, trying to catch my breath. I could hear Paul shouting, calling my name, his voice getting closer. I needed to find help, but I didn't know where I was. I decided to keep heading away from the cottage, hoping I'd find a road or another house. I moved as quietly as I could, every sound making my heart race. After what felt like hours, I saw lights through the trees. A house. I crept closer, praying someone was home. I reached the edge of the yard and saw a car in the driveway. I ran to the front door and banged on it, hoping whoever was inside would help me. The door opened, and an older woman stood there, looking confused and worried. I tried to explain what happened, but I was out of breath and soaking wet. She let me in and called the police. I could hear Paul's shouts in the distance, but I knew I was safe now. The police arrived quickly, and I told them everything. They found Paul searching the woods near the cottage. He tried to deny everything, but they found evidence in the house that backed up my story. Hidden cameras, restraints, things that made my skin crawl. I never found out what Paul's true intentions were, and I didn't want to. I just wanted to forget the whole ordeal. The police assured me he would be locked up for a long time, but it didn't make me feel much better. The rain had stopped by the time I left the police station. A friend picked me up and drove me home. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every creak and rustle, afraid that somehow Paul would find me. I knew it was irrational, but after that night, I couldn't help but feel that I was never truly safe. I worked as a delivery driver, mostly nights. It was raining hard when I got the call for a delivery to an unfamiliar address. The roads were slick and visibility was terrible. I had to drive slow, my headlights barely cutting through the sheets of rain. The address was in an industrial area, lots of warehouses. It didn't seem right for a food delivery, but I was too tired to think much of it. I pulled up to the gate of a big warehouse and saw a few cars parked outside. The place looked deserted, but I had a job to do. I grabbed the food and jogged to the door, getting soaked in seconds. As I approached, I noticed the door was slightly open. I hesitated but then pushed it wider and stepped inside, calling out that I had a delivery. That's when I saw them. A group of men huddled around a table with stacks of cash and what looked like drugs. They all turned to look at me, their faces a mix of shock and anger. One of them, a big guy with a scar on his cheek, started shouting. I didn't stick around to hear what he was saying. I dropped the food and bolted back to my car. I heard them coming after me, shouting and cursing. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, and finally got the car started. I slammed it into reverse, the tires slipping on the wet pavement. As I sped away, I saw headlights behind me. They were chasing me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I tried to call my boss, but my hands were too shaky to dial. I focused on the road, trying to lose them in the maze of warehouses. The rain made it nearly impossible to see, and every turn felt like a gamble. I turned down a narrow alley, hoping to hide, but the headlights were still behind me. I needed to think fast. I saw a gap between two buildings and squeezed my car through, scraping the sides. I turned off the lights and engine, praying they wouldn't find me. I sat there in the dark, holding my breath, listening to the rain pounding on the roof. The car that was chasing me drove past the alley. I waited until I couldn't hear their engine anymore before I dared to move. I turned the car back on and slowly crept out of the alley. I needed to get to the police, but I was still in the industrial area, and I had no idea where the nearest station was. I decided to head towards the main road, hoping to find help. My phone finally had signal, and I called 911, explaining what had happened as calmly as I could. The operator told me to stay on the line and keep driving towards town. I saw the lights of a police car up ahead, and I felt a huge wave of relief. I pulled over, and two officers approached my car, guns drawn. I showed them my ID and explained everything again. They took my statement and assured me they'd handle it. I was still shaking, but I felt safer knowing they were there. They escorted me back to the station, where I gave a full report. I stayed there for a few hours, waiting for my nerves to settle. When I finally got home, the rain had stopped, but the memory of those men's faces and the chase through the storm stayed with me. I couldn't sleep, kept seeing headlights in the dark, hearing the roar of engines behind me. The police followed up a few days later, saying they'd made some arrests. I tried to go back to work, but every time I got a delivery call, my hands started shaking again. I couldn't do it. I quit the job and found something else during the day. I was driving home from my night shift at the hospital. It was raining heavily, the kind of rain that makes it hard to see even with the wipers on full speed. I just wanted to get home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. The roads were almost empty, and I felt a bit of relief in that. Less traffic to worry about. I was about halfway home when I saw him. A man stumbling on the side of the road, drenched and holding his arm. He looked injured. My first instinct was to keep driving, but the nurse in me couldn't ignore someone in need. I pulled over and rolled down my window a bit. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" I asked. "Please, I've been in an accident. Can you take me to the nearest hospital?" he said, his voice weak. I hesitated for a moment but then unlocked the passenger door. "Get in. I'll take you." He climbed in, water dripping from his clothes, and I noticed he was shivering. He looked around nervously before settling into the seat. I started driving again, trying to focus on the road. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "My name's John." "I'm Alice," I replied. "What happened to you?" "Car skidded off the road," he said. I tried to call for help, but my phone's dead. Something about his story felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was clutching his arm, but there was no visible wound. He was also looking around the car too much, like he was assessing something. "How far is the hospital?" he asked, a bit too anxiously. "About 15 minutes, I said. "Just relax, we'll get there soon." He didn't seem to relax. Instead, he shifted in his seat, and I noticed something metallic under his jacket. My heart skipped a beat. Was that a knife? I kept my eyes on the road, trying to think. The rain was pounding on the car, making it hard to hear anything else. I had to stay calm, had to figure out what to do. "So, what do you do, John?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm between jobs right now," he said quickly. "Why?" "Just making conversation," I said. "Helps pass the time." He didn't respond. Instead, he shifted again, and this time I was sure I saw the handle of a knife. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I had to get out of this situation, but how? Then I remembered a police station about 10 minutes from where we were. If I could get there, maybe I could get help without him realizing. "I need to make a quick stop," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just to grab something from the store. It won't take long." "No," he said sharply. "Just get me to the hospital." His tone sent a chill down my spine. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "No problem." I drove past the store I had mentioned and kept heading towards the police station. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat mixing with the rain on my skin. I had to keep him calm until I could get help. As we got closer to the station, he seemed to get more agitated. He kept glancing around, and I was sure he knew something was up. I had to think fast. "There's a shortcut through this neighborhood," I said, turning onto a side street. It was a lie, but I needed to buy some time. "Where are you taking me?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Just a shortcut, I promise," I said. "We'll be there in no time." He didn't seem convinced. "Stop the car," he said suddenly. "I want out." "We're almost there," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "I said stop the car," he shouted, reaching for the knife. I slammed on the brakes, making the car skid on the wet road. He lunged at me, and I instinctively threw my hands up to protect myself. The knife slashed through the air, narrowly missing my face. I grabbed his wrist with both hands, trying to keep the knife away. We struggled in the confined space, the car rocking as we fought. I managed to elbow him in the ribs, and he grunted in pain, dropping the knife. I scrambled to grab it, but he punched me in the side of the head, making me see stars. I reached for the door handle and pushed it open, falling out into the rain. He was right behind me, but I kicked at him, catching him in the knee. He stumbled, giving me a moment to get to my feet. I ran towards the lights of the police station, screaming for help. 2 officers came running out, guns drawn. They quickly assessed the situation and tackled the man to the ground. I collapsed on the wet pavement, shaking and crying with relief. They took him away, and one of the officers helped me to my feet. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked. "I think so," I said, still shaking. "Thank you. Thank you so much." They took my statement and called an ambulance to check me over. As I sat in the back of the police car, wrapped in a blanket, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to something terrible. I eventually made it home, but the fear stayed with me for a long time. Every time it rained, I remembered that night and how lucky I was to be alive. The rain was coming down hard, sheets of water blurring the windshield as I drove. I could barely see the road ahead. I was exhausted from the long drive, and the relentless storm wasn't making it any easier. When I saw the flickering neon sign of a cheap motel up ahead, I decided to pull in. A night out of the rain sounded good. I parked the car and hurried inside, my jacket already soaked through. The man at the front desk barely looked up from his newspaper. I asked for a room, paid in cash, and got a key. Room 12. It was at the far end of the row, away from the road. I trudged through the rain, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was shabby, but it was dry. That was all that mattered. I threw my bag on the bed and took off my wet clothes. I was about to take a hot shower when I heard it. A faint scream. At first, I thought it was just the wind howling, but then I heard it again. It was coming from the room next door. I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't just any scream. It was the scream of someone in serious trouble. I pressed my ear against the wall. Muffled voices, harsh and angry, then another scream. I had to do something. I quickly got dressed and stepped out into the rain again. I walked over to the door of the room next to mine. Room 11. I could hear the voices more clearly now, a man's voice shouting and a woman crying. My gut twisted. I needed to help her, but I didn't know how. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door, trying to sound calm. "Hello? Is everything all right in there?" The shouting stopped. There was silence for a moment, then the door opened a crack. A man's face appeared, his eyes cold and hard. "What do you want?" I heard a scream, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is everything okay?" He glared at me. "Mind your own business," he snapped, and slammed the door shut. I stood there, drenched and shaking. I couldn't just walk away. I went back to my room and tried to think. I didn't have my phone with me. It was still in the car, and I didn't want to risk going back out. The front desk clerk didn't seem like the type to get involved in anything. I had to do something myself. I paced the room, my mind racing. Then I remembered something. I had a tire iron in the trunk of my car. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I grabbed my keys and ran back out to the car. I popped the trunk and grabbed the tire iron, holding it tight as I made my way back to room 11. I stood outside the door, listening. The woman was still crying, and the man was still shouting. I had to be smart about this. I couldn't just barge in. I needed to find a way to get the woman out without getting us both killed. I looked around and saw a small window at the back of the room, partially open. I crept around to it and peered inside. The room was dimly lit, but I could see the woman tied to a chair, her face bruised and tear-streaked. The man was pacing in front of her, holding a knife. I had to act fast. I quietly lifted the window higher and climbed inside. The man's back was to me, so he didn't see me. I moved silently, my heart pounding in my chest. When I was close enough, I swung the tire iron at his head with all my strength. It connected with a sickening thud. The man dropped to the floor, unconscious. I quickly moved to the woman and started untying her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you so much." "We need to get out of here," I said. "Can you walk?" She nodded, and I helped her to her feet. We climbed back out the window and hurried to my car. I got her into the passenger seat and jumped behind the wheel. We sped out of the parking lot, my heart racing. I drove to the nearest police station, not stopping until we were safely inside. I told the officers what had happened, and they immediately sent a squad car to the motel. The woman, whose name was Emily, was taken to the hospital to be checked out. I gave my statement to the police and stayed with her until her family arrived. The man was arrested, and Emily was safe. It was a night I would never forget, a night when I realized how quickly a simple act of kindness could turn into a fight for survival. The rain was coming down hard, and I could barely see through the windshield. My wipers were working overtime, but it didn't help much. I was driving back home after a long day at work, and all I wanted was to get to my warm bed. Suddenly, my car started sputtering. Before I knew it, the engine died, and I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. I tried to restart the car, but it wouldn't budge. My phone had no signal, and the rain was relentless. I felt a surge of panic. I didn't know what to do. As I sat there, a pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. A truck pulled up behind me, and a man got out. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. I hesitated, but I didn't have many options. "Yeah, my car broke down," I said. "Do you have a phone I can use?" "No signal out here," he said, shaking his head. "But I can give you a ride to the nearest town. It's about 15 miles away." I looked at my car, then back at him. The rain was pouring down harder, and I was soaked. I didn't want to spend the night in my car. "Okay, thanks," I said, grabbing my purse and locking the car. I climbed into the passenger seat of his truck. It smelled like cigarettes and old coffee. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road. For a while, we drove in silence, the only sound the rain pounding on the roof and the wipers squeaking across the windshield. After a few minutes, I noticed something strange. We were heading in the wrong direction. Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Isn't the town the other way?" He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Taking a shortcut," he said. I didn't believe him. My heart started to race. I looked at the door handle, considering my options. The truck was going too fast for me to jump out safely. I needed to come up with a plan. I tried to keep the conversation going, hoping to find a way to distract him. "So, do you live around here?" I asked. Just passing through, he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. Something was very wrong. I discreetly reached for my phone, even though I knew it had no signal. I opened the camera app and started recording, just in case. As we drove further into the darkness, I saw a sign that confirmed my fears. We were heading in the opposite direction of the town. I knew I had to act fast. I need to use the bathroom, I said, trying to sound casual. He grunted but didn't slow down. Hold it, he said. Panic set in. I had to get out of this truck. I saw a gas station up ahead, its lights dim in the rain. Can you please stop there? I asked, my voice shaking. I really need to go. He glanced at me again, and for a moment, I thought he would refuse. But then he nodded and pulled into the gas station. As soon as the truck stopped, I fumbled with the door handle and jumped out, running into the gas station. Inside, I ran to the counter, breathless and soaked. Please help me, I said to the cashier, a young woman with wide eyes. That man is not taking me where I need to go. She looked outside and saw the truck idling in the parking lot. Stay here, she said, picking up the phone. She called the police while I hid behind the counter, my heart pounding. A few minutes later, the truck sped off into the night. I stayed hidden until the police arrived. I told them everything, showing them the recording on my phone. They took my statement and assured me they would search for the man. The police drove me to a nearby motel, where I spent the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. The storm had passed, but the fear lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't escaped. The next morning, I got my car towed and repaired, and finally made it home. I decided to rent a farmhouse out in the country for a few weeks to work on my novel. It was isolated, just what I needed for some quiet writing time. The place was old, with creaky floors and thick walls. It felt like it was miles away from anything or anyone. One night, the storm came in. The rain was relentless, and the wind howled through the trees. It was hard to concentrate with all the noise. Around midnight, as I was trying to focus on a scene, I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. There were noises downstairs, thumps, shuffling, and the unmistakable sound of something breaking. I froze, straining to hear. The sounds were getting closer, and I realized someone was trying to break into the house. My first instinct was to hide, but then I thought about the layout of the farmhouse. There were 2 floors, and my room was on the second. If they got in, they would eventually make their way upstairs. I needed to stay calm and think. I quietly went to the window and peeked out through the blinds. All I saw was the rain pouring down and the occasional flash of lightning. No sign of anyone outside. The noises continued, louder now, and it was clear they were inside the house. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal out here. My heart was pounding. I had to get out of the house and find a way to contact the police. I checked the back door. It was locked tight. I decided to use the old fireplace as a means of escape. It had a small, hidden door that led to a crawl space. I opened it carefully and crawled in. The space was tight and filled with dust, but it was better than being found. The noises downstairs were growing more chaotic. I could hear voices now, harsh and low. I knew they were looking for something, and it wasn't long before I heard them climbing the stairs. My head was spinning. I crawled deeper into the space, trying to ignore the creeping feeling of claustrophobia. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for any sounds that might indicate their next move. I heard them moving around upstairs, checking rooms. I tried to keep my mind focused on the plan. If I could get to the nearest neighbor, they might be able to call the police. The farmhouse was surrounded by dense woods, and I had to be careful navigating through them in the storm. When the noises seemed to move away, I slowly and quietly crawled out of the space. The upstairs was silent, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they would be back. I needed to be quick. I slipped out of the house through a small side door that led to the back. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind nearly knocked me over as I stumbled into the woods. The trees were thick, and I had trouble seeing where I was going. I followed what I remembered was the path to the neighbor's house, but everything looked different in the storm. I tried to keep my steps light, but the mud made it hard to move fast. I kept going, even though I felt like I was moving in circles. Every crack of a branch or distant thunder made me jump. I couldn't afford to lose my way. The neighbor's house was my only hope. Finally, I saw a light in the distance. I pushed through the underbrush and stumbled into the driveway. I banged on the door, shouting for help. The lights flicked on, and a woman opened the door, looking startled. I quickly explained what happened, and she called the police for me. I could hear sirens in the distance, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. We waited together, her offering me a dry towel and some warm tea to calm my nerves. The police arrived and went to the farmhouse. They found the intruders, who turned out to be a group of thieves looking for valuables. They had been in the house for hours, but they didn't find anything because I had hidden everything away. I was shaken, but I was safe. The police assured me that I could return to the farmhouse, but I decided against it. I stayed with the neighbor for the rest of the night and went home the next morning. The storm had finally passed, but the experience left me rattled. It was a night like any other, except for the relentless rain hammering against my windows. I was working late in my home office, trying to finish up a project that had me behind schedule. The storm outside was so loud that it drowned out everything else, making it hard to focus. The occasional flash of lightning would light up the room, only to be swallowed by darkness again. Around midnight, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't answer, but I was expecting a call from a client, so I picked it up. The voice on the other end was rough, almost like it was distorted by static. "Jenna," the voice said, "I know what you did." My heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, then the voice said, "You don't need to play dumb. You know exactly what I'm talking about." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had no idea who this person was or what they were referring to. "I think you've got the wrong number," I said. The voice laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Don't play games with me. I know about the emails you've been sending. I know about your secret meetings. I hadn't been sending any emails I shouldn't have. And as for secret meetings, there were none." I felt a growing panic. "Listen, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to hang up now." Before I could, the call ended. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I tried calling back, but the number was disconnected. I felt uneasy but tried to push it aside. Maybe it was just a prank. But then the calls kept coming. Every time I answered, the caller would say something that made no sense or repeated vague threats. They knew details about my life, my job, my routines, even the names of a few friends. It was unsettling, to say the least. I tried to trace the calls, but the number always came up as blocked or unavailable. My attempts to block the number didn't work. They just kept calling from different ones. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger. After an hour of this, I noticed something odd. Every now and then, I'd see a shadow moving past the window when the lightning flashed. I tried to dismiss it as the effect of the rain or my imagination. But as the night dragged on, the feeling of dread only intensified. I decided to check outside. I carefully peeked out through the curtains, trying not to draw attention. The rain was coming down in sheets, and visibility was almost zero. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that someone was out there, hiding in the dark, was almost palpable. I went back inside, trying to calm myself. I locked all the doors and windows, and the calls continued. The callers seemed to be enjoying my fear, taunting me with personal details and telling me that my time was running out. I knew I had to do something. I called the police, but they told me to stay on the line and keep them updated if anything happened. They said they'd send someone over as soon as they could, but it might take a while given the storm. I felt alone, stranded, and vulnerable. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the back of the house. I jumped, my heart racing. I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat I kept for protection. The power flickered, and I knew the storm was causing disruptions. I went to the back door, shining the flashlight outside. The rain was coming down so hard that it was difficult to see anything. I carefully opened the door and stepped out, the mud squishing beneath my shoes. The backyard was empty, but I noticed a set of muddy footprints leading from the edge of the yard to the back door. They looked fresh, and the sight made my blood run cold. I quickly went back inside, locked the door, and called the police again, telling them about the footprints. They promised someone would be there soon. I sat in my office, waiting, the fear making it hard to concentrate. The calls had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. I felt like a sitting duck, waiting for something terrible to happen. After what felt like hours, there was a knock on the door. I hesitated but finally opened it to find two police officers standing there, soaked from the rain. They came in and began to investigate, checking around the property and asking me about the calls and any suspicious activity. As they spoke with me, I felt a bit of relief, but the dread never fully left. They did a thorough search of the area but found no one. They took the details of the calls and the muddy footprints and promised to keep an eye on things. Once they left, I locked up the house and tried to get some sleep. I left a light on and stayed close to my phone, ready to call for help if needed. The storm continued to rage outside, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. In the morning, the storm had passed, and the sun was out. The police had not reported any incidents from the night before. The unsettling feeling of being watched began to fade, but I knew I'd be more cautious from now on. The calls eventually stopped, and I never heard from the mysterious caller again. I decided to go camping in a remote area of the forest for a few days of solitude and relaxation. I picked a spot far from the main trails, hoping for peace and quiet. Everything was going well until the storm hit. It started as a light drizzle, but quickly turned into a torrential downpour. The wind was howling, and the rain was coming down so hard it felt like it might tear my tent apart. I packed up what I could and made a quick decision to find shelter. I remembered passing an old barn on the way to the campsite. It was about a half-mile away, so I grabbed my flashlight and started heading in that direction. The rain made the ground slippery, and I had to be careful not to fall. By the time I reached the barn, I was soaked through. The wind was so fierce it felt like it might blow me off my feet. I pushed the creaky door open and stepped inside. The barn was old and musty, but it was dry. I shined my flashlight around and saw some scattered hay bales and old farming equipment. At least I was out of the rain. As I settled into a corner, trying to warm up a bit, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints on the dirt floor, and the hay around them was disturbed. It looked like someone had been here recently, and not just passing through. There were also some discarded food wrappers and a couple of empty bottles. A shiver ran down my spine. I wasn't alone here, but I didn't see anyone. The storm outside was getting worse, and the sound of the wind and rain was so loud it was hard to hear anything else. I tried to stay calm and decided to wait it out until the storm passed. I kept my flashlight off to avoid drawing attention and sat very still. Every creak of the barn made me jump. The thought that someone might be hiding in here with me was making it hard to breathe. I kept listening, trying to detect any sounds that might hint at someone else's presence. The storm raged on, and it felt like the wind was getting even stronger. I heard a loud bang outside and my heart nearly stopped. I looked around the barn, searching for any possible weapons or ways to defend myself. The only thing I could find was a rusty pitchfork, which I picked up and held close, hoping it would be enough if I needed it. The barn door creaked open, and I froze. I was sure I had closed it properly. I quietly moved to a spot where I could see the door without being seen myself. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, I saw a shadowy figure standing just outside. My breath caught in my throat. They were looking inside, but they didn't come in right away. I held my flashlight tightly, ready to use it if necessary. The figure stayed outside for what felt like an eternity, and I tried to stay as quiet as possible. The rain was still pouring down, and the storm's fury seemed to be increasing. Finally, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. I waited for what felt like another hour before I dared to move. The storm had let up a bit, and I thought maybe it was safe to leave. I carefully made my way to the door, peeking outside. The rain was still coming down, but the wind had calmed slightly. I couldn't see anyone, but I didn't want to take any chances. I decided to go back to my campsite and pack up as quickly as possible. I figured it would be safer to leave the area rather than risk running into whoever had been in the barn. I grabbed my things and headed out, trying to avoid the muddy patches that might make me slip. The path back to my campsite was treacherous. The storm had made the trail almost impassable. I slipped a few times but managed to keep my balance. When I finally reached my campsite, I was relieved to find that my tent was still standing, though it was soaked. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, knowing that the storm was still unpredictable. I felt a sense of urgency. The sooner I could get out of here, the better. I was about to leave when I heard footsteps nearby. I froze, my heart racing. I could see the figure of someone moving through the trees, and it wasn't far from my campsite. I hurriedly finished packing and decided to take a different route out, hoping to avoid the person who might be looking for me. I moved quickly but carefully, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The rain was still heavy, and the sound of it on the leaves masked my movements somewhat. When I finally reached my car, I was exhausted and drenched. I threw my wet gear into the back seat and started the engine, eager to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror but didn't see anyone following me. I took one last look at the forest before turning onto the main road and heading home. The storm eventually passed, and the sun came out the next day, but the fear of that night stayed with me.